Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And that equates, as those of you on the East Coast know, it's 1 o'clock p.m. on the East Coast. And our purpose each week is to talk about military history, military doctrine, the practices of great military leaders, and distill from them lessons that we can use in order to run our businesses better, improve our professional prospects, and all around take a lot of the knowledge and wisdom from the military and translate it to the civilian world. So, as advertised today, I'm going to talk about. For those of you who've watched the show, you know this. One of my favorite military people, General George S. Patton Jr., and how he rescued the 101st Airborne Division during the Battle of the Bulge. So, just to set the scene a little bit, so D-Day, June 4th, 1940. I'm sorry, June 6th, 1944, marked the Allies' essentially their re-entrance into continental Europe at the beaches on Normandy. And from there, they eventually broke out through the beach into what was called the bocage country. This was the hedgerows that separated fields in northern France, and started making their way toward Germany. And the Allied, what was known as the Allied Expeditionary Force, was commanded by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his headquarters was known as SHAEF, SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. And under Eisenhower was Omar Bradley. And under Omar Bradley, and Omar Bradley was a Army group commander, and he commanded two armies. And under one of the armies under Omar Bradley, General Omar Bradley, was General Patton, Patton's famous Third Army. And he was kind of moving through the middle. And to the north, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was working his way through the Netherlands and then down into Germany from there. So by this point, which is in the winter of 1944, things were looking pretty desperate for Nazi Germany. And Hitler was, although he probably didn't think so at the time, was coming down to the end of his reign of terror as the dictator of Nazi Germany. And so he pretty much bet the farm on a military plan to basically sweep out of Germany and through the Argonne Forest and into the Netherlands, intending along the way to capture petrol supplies for his tanks, and eventually reaching the ports in the Netherlands, where he hoped to cut off the Allies' supplies, and therefore force the Allies to, if nothing else, sue for peace. It was, by any standard, an audacious plan, and it wasn't, as many people have said, that it was completely foolhardy. There was no chance it was going to succeed, and yet the reality is it came very close to succeeding. So as Hitler's armies worked their way through the forest, the 101st Airborne Division was dropped into Bastogne with the intention of holding the line against the Germans, and they were very quickly surrounded by by the German army. And there's, of course, the famous um, uh, incident where General McAuliffe was called upon by the Nazi army commander to surrender, and he responded with the one-word message, nuts, meaning he was not going to surrender. But the situation in Bastogne was nonetheless quite desperate. And so Eisenhower convened a meeting at SHAEF of his senior leaders, including Omar Bradley, um, uh, George Patton. I don't believe Montgomery was there, but Montgomery's number two was there. And Eisenhower asked the simple question, what can we do to essentially save the 101st Airborne Division? And, there was some, kind of mumbling around the table. And Patton spoke up and he said, well, I can attack with, he said two divisions or three divisions within, 48 or 72 hours. And Patton made the statement very matter of factly. There was no bragging behind the statement. And the response he got was incredulity on the part of Montgomery's number two and even Omar Bradley. Patton had been fighting a tremendous fight with Third Army driving east. His men had been fighting for a long time without rest, and the Montgomery's number two suggested that it wouldn't be possible for his men to march roughly, I believe it was 100 miles to the north, engage with a German army in battle. And Patton's simple response was, I've trained these men and they will do what I have trained them to do. So he had absolutely unshakable confidence. So before I go any further, I'm going to play for you just a very short video of footage from the Battle of the Bulge. By the way, it was called the Battle of the Bulge because Hitler attacked the Allied lines, which were essentially in a line, and he pushed them back, creating a bulge in their lines. And that bulge, Bastogne, was within that bulge, and what Patton proposed to do was to drive directly north into the bulge in an effort to rescue the 101st Airborne Division and essentially stop the Nazi offensive. So, like I said, I'm going to play a short video. It's about 2 minutes, and it's actually called General George S. Patton at the Battle of the Bulge. So just take a look at this and see, the obligatory commercial, of course. You'll get a feeling for what's going on or what was happening during the Battle of the Bulge. I'll unmute it after the commercial is open is over. Okay, so I guess Volkswagen gets a free commercial at the expense of the Way to Wow shows. So okay, all right, here we go. So of course this is the Nazi army. See, December 16th, 1904. So the Allies were not expecting this counter offensive, and that was part of the reason why it was so effective. This was actual footage, so it gives you a sense of how terrible the fighting was. So the weather was terrible, and for several days, the Allied air forces couldn't fly, but eventually they were able to take to the air and they were able to drop supplies, as you can see here. Also start bombing the Nazi positions. So the caption there about running out of ammunition, etc., fuel, was accurate, but it was a near run thing. Um, Among the tactics the Nazi used were they had specially trained units dressed as American soldiers who infiltrated the American lines, looking to get uh, uh, to get fuel, and they were quite effective, and they caused quite a bit of havoc in the within the Allied lines. So that gives you an idea of the kind of fighting that was going on, how desperate it was. Artillery, machine gun fire, the snow, the cold. While the Nazi army was prepared for those conditions, as the veteran there who was at the Battle of the Bulge said, the American army was not, and so there was frostbite, and there were soldiers freezing to death, and into this milieu came General Patton, and he was successful in relieving the 101st Airborne from at Bastogne, and that sort of gave a morale boost to the Allies, and they were able to stop the German counteroffensive in it pretty much in its tracks at that point, and then reverse the ground that they had made, and eventually, of course, they pushed into Germany, and as we know, the Allies won. Okay, now of course the Russians were coming from the east. The Allies were the Allies, meaning the British, the Americans, along with some French forces and some other. There were Polish flyers, for example. They were coming from the west, and eventually they met, and Germany was forced to surrender. By then, Hitler had committed suicide with his mistress. Well, she was actually his wife at that point. He married her just before they committed suicide. Their bodies were burned outside of a bunker they were hid in, so that they wouldn't be taken by the Allies and displayed, which Hitler did not want to have happen. So why was General Patton able to accomplish this feat that pretty much everyone else at SHAEF thought could not be done? So I've drawn up 6 points that I want to share with you, that I think reflect not just Patton's overall genius, but how he was able to embrace the moment and turn what looked like catastrophe into opportunity. And I think we'd all like to be able to do that in our businesses. It's, it takes a certain set of capabilities, if you will. But none of these, I think, are things that we're born with. And certainly Patton was not born with these abilities. If you read any comprehensive biography of General Patton, his family and he made himself what he became. He was not born to it in the sense that he had some inborn talent. So first and foremost is Patton schooled himself in warfare, in the history of warfare, so thoroughly, he was able to create a strategic vision of how the war could be won by the Allies. And he held very firm to that strategic vision because he knew it was based on thousands of years of military history that he had deeply studied. He knew a tremendous amount of military history by heart. He could go to ruins of fortresses and such and describe the battles that had taken place, but from memory, from the earliest days BC into contemporary times for him. And because he was so well steeped in what is often called the art of warfare, he was able to understand not only what the Allies needed to do, but what the Germans needed to do in order to try and win the war. So it's very likely, although I don't recall ever reading that this was the case, but it was very likely that Patton anticipated something like the Battle of the Bulge offensive or counteroffensive on the part of Hitler, and had, because he could understand the battle from both sides. And that was a large part of what we might call his genius, is he could sit on the other side of the table and as effectively understand his opponent as he could himself and his colleagues. And so he knew that the only way to defeat the Nazis was to defeat the Nazi army. He didn't ever believe that strategic bombing would destroy the industrial capability of Nazi Germany. He had no faith in that. He had no faith in set piece battles. Indeed, the way Patton saw it is the only way to defeat Germany was to defeat her armies to the point where Germany could no longer fight. And so all of his effort, mental effort, spiritual effort, and physical effort, of course, was directed to how do I engage with the Nazi armies in a way that I can destroy them and therefore break Nazi power and essentially convince Nazi Germany to surrender. So we too, in our businesses, need to have a firm, well-grounded strategic vision. And that comes from a thorough knowledge of our industry, of economic conditions, of our competitors, of our suppliers. So the more we know about all of the various aspects that impact our business, the better the strategic vision is that we can develop. And that strategic vision needs to be there if we're going to succeed. So to use an example, everyone probably knows about Elon Musk. I've never met him. This is not a comment, good or bad, on him. This is only to say that if one listens to or reads about Elon Musk, you see he has a very clear strategic vision for what he is doing. He believes in using technology to the utmost in order to solve big problems facing mankind. He may not say it exactly that way, but that is his strategic vision. And he is so deeply immersed in technology. There probably aren't many people who are more deeply immersed in it, if any. That he was able to create companies like Tesla, like SpaceX, even his venture in buying Twitter and converting it into X is part of that larger vision. So we need to create a strategic vision, and we need to share that vision with our people and get their buy-in so that we're all working toward the accomplishment of that strategic vision. Now, it's not enough just to have a strategic vision. Patton was incredibly adaptable. He could change course very rapidly, as is demonstrated by his rescue of the 101st Airborne Division at the Bulge, where he literally turned on a dime, made a 90-degree turn, headed north, and after marching 100 miles or so, was able to engage the enemy in combat and prevail. Now, why was he able to do that? It seems like, okay, well, it's no big deal. He just turns his army and starts marching. Well, yes, except for armies that fought in World War II had huge logistical needs. You didn't just merely march in a different direction. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of men who were involved. All this needed to be coordinated, down to to the divisions, to the regiments, to the battalions, to the companies, to the platoons, to the squads, etc. All that had to happen, and it had to happen in a very coordinated way. Otherwise, it would have been disastrous. So one of the reasons why Patton was so adaptable is he was always having his planning team, his staff, develop alternative plans based on what he thought the enemy might do. And in fact, before he left his headquarters to go to the meeting at Schaeff to discuss the response to the German counteroffensive, he had already set his staff planning for making that 90-degree turn and engaging with the enemy at Bastogne. And so he had that almost foresight, if you will, to know where he might need to act and therefore to plan for it. So while by the time he was sitting at Schaeff and talking to this meeting of all the senior leadership, he already knew that his staff was working on the logistics to make happen what he said he could do. And in fact, he said that at the meeting. So I already have my staff working on the plans. And so all I've got to do is get back there and tell them, we're moving on Bastogne. So it was this kind of foresight that gave him a level of adaptability that was really unique to Patton among the Army commanders in World War II. Okay, so and there were other things that helped him be adaptable. I'm going to talk about those in a minute, but I want to talk about something else that people typically don't associate with Patton, because he especially in the eponymous movie Patton from 1970, he's portrayed as this reckless, individual. He didn't care about the safety or care of his men. That couldn't be farther from the truth. Indeed, everything that Patton did was geared toward the safety of his army, in the sense that he didn't want to suffer or have his army suffer one more death or one more casualty if it could be avoided. But here's the difference between Patton and a general like Omar Bradley. Patton knew the reality of war, and the reality of war is soldiers are killed and soldiers are wounded. So it's not a matter of avoiding having any soldiers killed or wounded. It's a matter of minimizing how many soldiers and how many soldiers are killed and wounded. And his method of doing that was to always keep pressure on the enemy, always drive forward, never stop, never give the enemy time to relax, to regroup, to resupply. Whereas, for example, Field Marshal Montgomery, he would set up a battle, he'd fight the battle, he'd win or he'd lose, he'd fall back a little bit, he'd regroup, and then he'd go again. The problem is, as while he's regrouping, so is the enemy. And General Patton believed that that was a huge mistake. He once remarked to Montgomery, when Montgomery said, he said to Patton, I would think you would want to fall back and regroup, rest and regroup. And Patton's response was, I never want to pay for the same real estate twice. Now, that sounds like a bragging kind of statement, but what Patton meant is it took the deaths and wounding of soldiers to gain this ground, to fall back and then spend more soldiers' lives and limbs taking it again, made no sense to Patton at all. Rather, his idea was always be planning for the next stage, so we can keep going, even if we have to rotate units in and out, so that we can keep pushing. We keep pushing, we keep pressure on the enemy. We never let up on the enemy. And that is how he managed risk, right? And it sounds somewhat counterintuitive. How can you manage risk by always fighting? But the reality is that by continually keeping pressure on the enemy and gaining ground, it meant that General Patton was getting closer and closer to the objective of winning the war. Okay, and so in reality, the casualties among Third Army were not really any higher than they were in any of the other armies, because he didn't have the repetitive casualties of advancing, falling back, resting, regrouping, going again, et cetera, et cetera. So Patton had a unique way of looking at risk management. And those two things, adaptability and risk management, need to go together because we don't want them working out of concert. So at the same time that we're looking strategically at our businesses and saying, okay, we've set our strategic direction, what could push us off and keep us from meeting that objective? And how do I plan for that? Okay. And at the same time, how do I minimize the risk that I incur by getting put off my objective? And it may not be by standing down, rethinking things, taking a formal regrouping. It may be by continuing to press on and press through the problem in order to gain the objective. Okay, so that's something each of us has to figure out based on the industry that we're in, the kind of business we have, the resilience of our team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But adaptability and risk management need to be dealt with, enmeshed basically. Otherwise, the risk that we're not managing could cause one of our alternative plans to fail. Okay, so we need to look at those two together. All right. Excuse me. The next thing that made Patton's rescue at the Bulge or at Bastogne so effective was his decisiveness as a leader. Excuse me. So at the point where Patton said at the SHAEF meeting, I can attack with 2 divisions in I think it was 48 hours. It may have been 72 hours. He committed right then to make that happen. That's why I say the statement was not made with any bragging. It was a simple statement of fact. He was that decisive. He had molded his staff, his army, and he knew what their capabilities were. And he knew that if he told them, okay, you created this plan to attack Bastogne, we're going in 72 hours. So make it happen. He knew it would happen because, number one, his staff and his army knew if General Patton made a decision, that was it. This is what we were doing. He did not waffle. He was not wishy-washy. He followed through. Now, how could he be so decisive? And the reason he could be so decisive, there were really two of them. One is he practiced being decisive. Okay. Now that sounds strange. You practice being decisive. General Patton studied leadership, especially military leadership, and he learned the qualities of great military leaders. And then he practiced those qualities and embedded them in himself. That's number one. And then number two, he trained his army to know that when he made a decision, that decision had to be carried out. And so he spread that sense of decisiveness throughout his staff and throughout his army. So when you have a group of people who are emulating decisiveness and you make a decision, they drive forward. And decisiveness oftentimes is the difference between success and failure. And for Patton, he wanted success. Did he always get it? No, clearly not. There were times when he failed. But the fact that he made a decision, pursued the decision as assertively as he could, okay, there were times when he had to take a different alternative. But then when at the point where he knew he had to do something else, he made another decisive decision and off he went in the new direction. So for those of us who are running businesses, we need to practice decisiveness. So when we talk to our staff, we can take in their information, we can take in their recommendations, we can discuss it with them. But before we leave, we need to say, okay, here's what we're going to do. And after a time, if we stick to that, our staff will learn, okay, the decision has been made and we're going to go forward. And if we reward the people who, whether they agree with the decision or not, are most committed to bringing about the realization of that decision, people will see that decisiveness is valued, and so they will develop their own decisiveness. Okay, and that's what Patton did with Third Army, and that's what we need to do in our businesses. Now, one of the things that made Patton such a great leader was he was an extremely effective communicator. Now, again, he did not grow up as a great communicator. Far from it. In fact, he was probably dyslexic. He had a difficult time because of that. He had a somewhat high-pitched voice. He did not sound like George C. Scott. Okay, and so Patton spent time basically practicing communicating while looking in the mirror to see what are my facial expressions, how do I need to change them in order to communicate more effectively, how do I need to modulate the tenor of my voice in order to communicate more effectively, what words do I need to use in order to communicate more effectively. So a woman once asked Patton about his use of profanity, despite the fact that George Patton was a deeply religious man. And what he said was essentially, you know, ma'am, when I need to give orders, I lay it on nice and thick so they'll remember it. And that was his excuse for using profanity. He never used profanity in front of women. And in fact, in social situations, he never used profanity either. He used it in battle, in dealing with his staff and his army during combat operations. But beyond that, he didn't. So it was a trait that he practiced, that he developed. Now, by the way, I am not recommending using profanity, but all I'm saying is, or what I'm saying is that we can become effective communicators through practice, through reading about how to communicate effectively. And of course, decisiveness helps with effective communication, because if we're clear about what we want to happen, then that's the first step in then being able to communicate clearly and effectively what we want our team members to do. Finally, and although this is the last point I'm going to mention, it's by no means the most minor. Patton was a master at motivating and inspiring his soldiers. So people, it's said that soldiers either loved or hated General Patton, and that's generally true. Most of his soldiers loved him. They loved how decisive he was, how uncompromising he was in defeating Nazi Germany, how much he cared about their welfare, and how he admired them. There's no doubt that Patton loved and admired the soldiers of Third Army. And so because of his commitment to them, he was a tremendously motivating force behind the soldiers in Third Army. And again, this was not something that he had as a natural talent, so to speak. Patton's father and his aunt, from his earliest days, read him inspiring stories about battles from history, from the Bible, and they encouraged him to emulate these great leaders and to practice. And so when he was a child, Patton would enlist his sister in creating mock scenarios of battles that he had been told stories about. And so from his earliest days, he had to motivate his sister to join in him with this, it was really play. They were little kids. But from those earliest days, his father and aunt were training him to be able to motivate and inspire people. And we too, as business leaders, we need to develop the ability to motivate and inspire people. Now, some people say that Patton motivated his army through fear. That is not my read of Patton. Quite to the contrary. What he motivated them through was pride in what Third Army can accomplish. And that's why he was very strict about matters of dress, matters of deportment. So all of these things he felt gave a soldier pride in himself, in his unit, in his army. And he felt that a soldier that was proud of the organization of which he was a part would be motivated not to let his colleagues down, his fellow soldiers down. So for Patton, it wasn't about people adulating him. It was about them having a reverence for Third Army and wanting to have Third Army painted with glory, or reversed, to not want Third Army to be painted with ignominy, because they had so much pride in this. And so it bound the soldiers together. And that was a tremendously inspiring, a tremendously motivating force. And we can do the same thing. If we have a strategic vision for our company, if we encourage forward thinking so that we can be adaptable, while at the same time work to identify risks that we can mitigate or manage, if we can be decisive in our decision making and communicate those decisions effectively, we will, in essence, create morale. We will create an inspiring feeling in our team. And now we've come full circle because we've created an organization that will actively pursue achieving our strategic vision. So those are the lessons of of Patton's rescue of the 101st Airborne Division at the Battle of Bulge in Bastogne. Look, there are certainly other lessons we could draw, but the reality is, I think those are the ones that are most important for us in civilian business to emulate, to replicate in order to gain success. So that's our show for today. I did go a little bit long, so hopefully you were okay hanging in there with me. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money, and I will be talking about my favorite book on investing, at least securities investing, called A Random Walk Down Wall Street. The book first came out 50 years ago, and I think it is as cogent an investing strategy today as it was when it first came out. So I invite you to join me tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific. As well, I invite you to post your comments, your thoughts, your criticisms on the show today, especially if you know something about General Patton, the other leaders that I mentioned. You know the history of the Bulge. Let's engage in a dialogue and share some ideas. That's always a very fruitful process. So you can post in social media. All of the links will be in the show notes after this episode posts on YouTube. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do by saluting my dear friend Marie. You are my belle. Courage at all times.